Welcome to these gentle journeys into the wisdom of acceptance. Tonight, we'll walk alongside people who are discovering one of life's most profound truths, that peace comes not from controlling what happens to us, but from choosing how we respond to what unfolds. In the mountains of ancient Greece, philosophers understood that the strongest trees are those that bend with the storm rather than resist it. Tonight, you'll meet a gardener learning from the seasons, a bookshop owner flowing like water around obstacles, a doctor finding grace in letting go, and a grieving father discovering that love transcends loss. These aren't just stories, they're invitations to explore your own relationship with change, challenge, and the quiet courage found in acceptance. As you settle into comfort, let these tales remind you that some of life's greatest strength is found not in fighting the current, but in learning to swim with it. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the first story begin. The Garden of Seasons. In the rolling hills outside a small Mediterranean village, there lived an old gardener named Elena. For 30 years, she had tended the same plot of land, watching it transform through countless seasons, learning its moods and mysteries with a patience that only comes from deep understanding. Elena had not always been a gardener. In her youth, she had been a successful architect in the city, designing grand buildings and complex structures. She had lived by schedules and deadlines, always pushing against time, always trying to control outcomes. But life, as it often does, had other plans. A series of events, a failed business partnership, the loss of her savings, and a health scare that forced her to slow down, had brought her to this quiet hillside. At first, she had seen it as a defeat, a retreat from the life she had carefully constructed. But as the months turned to years, she began to understand something profound about acceptance that no architecture textbook had ever taught her. This particular morning, as autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Elena walked slowly through her garden, her weathered hands trailing along the plants she knew so intimately. The tomato vines, once heavy with summer's bounty, now hung sparse and yellowing. The roses had given their final blooms, their petals scattered like confetti on the dark soil. The herb garden, which had been so fragrant just weeks before, now carried the earthy scent of approaching dormancy. A younger person might have seen decay, endings, failure. But Elena saw something different. She saw the natural rhythm of existence, the wisdom of letting go, the beauty of acceptance that flows like water finding its level. She paused at a patch where her prized dahlias had once stood tall and proud. Now they were brown stalks, their glory days seemingly over. A year ago, this sight would have filled her with sadness, maybe even frustration. She might have rushed to cut them down, to clean up what appeared to be failure. But time and countless seasons had taught her patience. "Everything has its time," she whispered to herself, words that had become her morning meditation. It was a phrase that echoed the ancient Stoic understanding that all things in nature follow their proper course, and our role is not to fight this course but to align ourselves with it. Elena settled onto her favorite wooden bench, placed strategically to catch the morning sun and overlook the entire garden. From here, she could see the complete picture, not just the ending of one season, but the preparation for the next. Beneath the seemingly lifeless dahlia stalks, she knew the tubers were storing energy for spring. The falling leaves would nourish the soil. The dormant fruit trees were gathering strength for next year's blossoms. This understanding hadn't come easily. Elena remembered her first autumn in the garden, how she had fought against the natural cycle. She had tried to extend the growing season with artificial lights and heated coverings. She had mourned each plant that succumbed to frost as if it were a personal failure. She had exhausted herself trying to maintain summer in the face of winter's inevitability. The futility of that struggle had eventually taught her what the ancient philosopher Epictetus had understood centuries ago. There are things within our control and things beyond it, and wisdom lies in knowing the difference. Elena could not control the changing seasons, the length of days, or the first killing frost. But she could control how she responded to these changes. As she sat in the growing warmth of the morning sun, Elena reflected on how this garden wisdom had transformed not just her relationship with plants, but her entire approach to life. When her elderly neighbor had become ill the previous spring, Elena had not wasted energy raging against the unfairness of disease or the cruelty of aging. Instead, she had focused on what she could control, bringing homemade soup, sitting companionably during treatments, listening without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. When the local government had proposed building a highway that would cut through part of the village, Elena had not spent sleepless nights worrying about changes she couldn't influence. Instead, she had channeled her energy into the community meetings where her voice could make a difference, speaking calmly and rationally about preserving the character of their home. The garden had taught her that acceptance was not passivity. It was not giving up or becoming resigned to whatever happened. True acceptance, she had learned, was an active practice, the daily choice to work with reality rather than against it, to find peace in the present moment while still taking purposeful action where action was possible. A small movement caught her eye. Near the base of the dying dahlia stalks, something green was emerging. Elena walked over and knelt carefully, her joints protesting slightly in the cool morning air. There, pushing up through the mulch of fallen leaves, were the first shoots of the spring bulbs she had planted years ago. Crocuses, preparing to bloom even though winter hadn't fully arrived, following their own ancient timeline. She smiled at this reminder that endings and beginnings were often simultaneous, that death and life danced together in an eternal rhythm. The Stoic philosophers had understood this too, that loss and gain, joy and sorrow, growth and decay were all part of the same essential process. Elena thought about her city life, how she had always been planning for the next project, the next success, the next achievement. She had lived perpetually in the future, rarely present to the moment she was actually experiencing. The garden had taught her presence. Each day brought its own tasks, its own small miracles, its own lessons in acceptance. As the morning progressed and the sun climbed higher, Elena continued her gentle rounds. She collected the last of the hardy herbs, grateful for their persistence. She gathered fallen apples from beneath the old tree, not mourning the ones that were too bruised to use but appreciating the ones that would make excellent preserves. She pulled up the spent annual flowers, composting their remains to feed next year's growth. With each task, she practiced the meditation of acceptance. This flower had given all it had to give this season, acceptance. This tree was preparing for winter's rest, acceptance. This soil needed time to regenerate, acceptance. This gardener needed to move more slowly than she once did, acceptance. By midday, Elena had finished her morning work. She prepared a simple lunch from the garden's remaining harvest, late tomatoes, hardy greens, fresh herbs. As she ate, she reflected on how different this meal was from the rushed business lunches of her former life. There was no agenda here, no deal to close, no timeline to meet. There was only the taste of food grown by her own hands, the satisfaction of work done in harmony with natural rhythms, the peace that comes from wanting what you have. The afternoon brought a gentle rain, and Elena watched it from her kitchen window. Once, she might have been frustrated by rain on a day she had planned to work outside. Now she saw it as a gift. Water for the plants, rest for the gardener, a reminder that nature's timing was often better than her own. As evening approached, Elena made her way back to the garden bench. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled of wet earth and dying leaves. She pulled a soft shawl around her shoulders and settled in to watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. This was her favorite time of day, when the boundary between day and night softened, when the garden settled into evening's quiet embrace. It was a time for reflection, for gratitude, for the deep acceptance that comes at the end of a day well lived. Elena thought about the seasons of her own life. Her spring had been full of ambition and energy, planting seeds of career and relationships with the confidence of youth. Her summer had brought the full flowering of success, the busy abundance of a life in full bloom. Her autumn, which she was living now, was teaching her different lessons. It was showing her the beauty of letting go, the wisdom of slowing down, the deep satisfaction of having grown something meaningful over time. And winter. Elena no longer feared her winter. She understood now that it too would have its own gifts, the clarity that comes with stillness, the appreciation for simple warmth, the deep rest that prepares for new growth. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Elena offered her evening gratitude. She was grateful for the garden that had become her teacher, for the seasons that had shown her the rhythm of acceptance, for the hands that could still tend growing things, for the heart that had learned to find peace in what is rather than longing for what was or might be. The night settled around her like a gentle blanket, and Elena made her way inside, carrying with her the day's lessons in acceptance. Tomorrow would bring its own tasks, its own small choices between resistance and flow. But tonight, she rested in the deep satisfaction of a life lived in harmony with the unchanging truth that change itself is the only constant, and that peace lies not in controlling the seasons of our lives, but in dancing gracefully with each one as it comes. The river's teaching. The old bridge had stood for more than a century, its weathered stone arches spanning the river that divided the mountain town of Millbrook. Every morning for the past 5 years, David had walked across this bridge on his way to the small bookshop he owned in the village center. But this morning felt different. This morning, he walked slowly, deliberately, paying attention to the water flowing beneath his feet in a way he never had before. 3 days ago, David had received news that would change everything. The developers had won their legal battle. The dam project would proceed. Within 2 years, the river that had carved this valley for millennia would be redirected, the town partially flooded, and most of the residents, including David, would need to relocate. The bookshop he had built from nothing, the community he had served for 15 years, the life he had carefully constructed, all of it would disappear beneath the waters of progress. David paused halfway across the bridge and leaned against the stone railing. Below him, the river flowed as it had for thousands of years, carving its path through rock and soil with patient persistence. The water was clear this morning, running swift and purposeful toward the distant sea. He watched leaves and small branches carried along by the current, noting how they didn't fight the flow but moved with it, finding their own path within the river's larger journey. For the past 3 days, David had cycled through every emotion: rage at the developers, despair over the loss of his business, anxiety about an uncertain future. He had spent hours researching legal appeals, organizing community resistance meetings, and calculating the financial impact of starting over somewhere else. But standing here now, watching the river's ancient dance, he felt something different beginning to stir within him. Not defeat, but a quieter recognition that perhaps there was another way to understand what was happening. David had always been a reader, and in his years of running the bookshop, he had encountered the wisdom of the Stoic philosophers many times. Their words had lived on his shelves and occasionally in his conversations with customers, but he had never truly needed their guidance until now. This morning, watching the water flow, he began to understand what they meant when they spoke of living according to nature, of accepting what we cannot change while acting on what we can. The river, he realized, was the perfect teacher of acceptance. It didn't rage against the rocks that blocked its path. It found a way around them or patiently wore them down. It didn't mourn the leaves that fell into its current. It carried them forward as part of its journey. When the seasons changed its volume and speed, it adapted, neither clinging to spring's fullness nor dreading winter's low flow. David pulled out the small notebook he always carried and began to write, not about legal strategies or relocation plans, but about what the river was teaching him in this moment. He wrote about how water was both powerful and yielding, how it could carve grand canyons over time while remaining soft enough to cradle falling leaves. He wrote about how the river's strength came not from resistance but from persistence, not from fighting change but from flowing with it while maintaining its essential nature. As he wrote, David thought about his own journey to this place. The bookshop hadn't been his first career. 20 years ago, he had been a successful marketing executive in the city, climbing corporate ladders and chasing quarterly targets. But that life had felt increasingly hollow, like swimming against a current that grew stronger each year. The decision to leave it all behind and open a small bookshop in a mountain town had seemed crazy to his colleagues and family. Yet here, he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for, a sense of purpose, a connection to community, a life lived at a more human scale. Now, facing the loss of this life he had built, David felt the familiar urge to fight, to resist, to hold on with white knuckles to what was slipping away. But the river whispered a different wisdom. What if, instead of seeing this change as a catastrophe, he could see it as the next phase of his own journey? What if, like water meeting a dam, he could find a new channel for his essential purpose? David thought about the books that had meant the most to his customers over the years. They weren't just objects on shelves, they were vessels for ideas, stories, wisdom that could travel anywhere. The conversations he had had with readers, the recommendations he had made, the quiet sanctuary he had created for people hungry for literature. These things weren't tied to a specific building or location. They were part of who he had become, and no flood could wash that away. A fisherman appeared upstream, wading carefully into the current with his fly rod. David watched as the man worked with the river's flow, casting his line where the current would carry it naturally, reading the water's mood and responding accordingly. There was no force in his movements, no fighting against the river's nature. Instead, there was a kind of partnership, a dance between human intention and natural force. This image sparked something in David's mind. What if he approached the coming changes not as something to be fought, but as something to be danced with? What if, instead of mourning what he was losing, he could focus on what he might be gaining? The opportunity to serve readers in a new place, to build community somewhere else, to trust in his own ability to create meaning wherever he went. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the stone bridge and casting dancing reflections on the water below. David noticed how the light didn't cling to any one spot but moved constantly, illuminating different parts of the river as it flowed. This too seemed like a lesson, that beauty and meaning didn't have to be static, that they could travel, adapt, find new forms while maintaining their essential nature. David closed his notebook and continued his walk to the bookshop, but his perspective had shifted. Instead of seeing the shop as something he was about to lose, he began to see it as something he had been privileged to steward for a time. The books would find new homes, the reading chairs would comfort new readers, and he would carry forward the most important thing, his ability to connect people with stories and ideas that mattered. That day, as customers came and went, David found himself listening to their concerns about the coming changes with new ears. Mrs. Patterson, who came in every Tuesday for the latest mystery novels, was devastated about leaving her garden. "I've spent 40 years making that soil perfect," she said, tears in her eyes. "How can I start over at my age?" David gently suggested that perhaps she wasn't losing 40 years of gardening wisdom, but carrying it forward to enrich new soil. He shared what the river had taught him that morning: that experience doesn't disappear when circumstances change, it transforms and finds new expression. Young Tom, fresh out of college and just starting his life in Millbrook, was angry about having his future plans disrupted. David listened to his frustration and then shared a story about how rivers, when diverted from their original course, often discover new territories they never would have reached otherwise. Sometimes, he suggested, disruption was life's way of pushing us toward discoveries we couldn't have imagined. As the weeks passed, David found himself returning to the bridge each morning, drawing strength and wisdom from the river's constant teaching. He began to approach the practical challenges of relocation with the river's combination of persistence and flexibility. He researched new locations not with desperation but with curiosity, asking not, "Where can I recreate exactly what I'm losing?" but, "Where might my purpose find new expression?" He started reaching out to other bookshop owners who had faced similar challenges, learning from their experiences of transformation and adaptation. He began to see the network of relationships he had built, with publishers, distributors, fellow book lovers, not as something tied to a specific place but as a portable community that could support his work anywhere. David also began to help other community members process their own journey of acceptance. He organized evening gatherings at the bookshop, not to plan resistance strategies but to explore how they might carry forward what they valued most about their community, even as they said goodbye to the place itself. He led discussions about books that dealt with themes of change, loss, and renewal, helping people find frameworks for understanding their experience. One evening, as autumn painted the valley in brilliant colors, David stood once again on the bridge. The river was running lower now, preparing for winter's rest, but it flowed with the same steady purpose. He realized that his own journey of acceptance wasn't complete, it was ongoing, like the river's flow. Some days he felt at peace with the changes ahead, other days the grief of loss would catch him unexpectedly. But he had learned to see these fluctuations as natural, like the river's seasonal changes in depth and speed. The bookshop's last day arrived sooner than expected. A buyer from the city had offered to purchase David's entire inventory, giving him the resources he needed to start fresh elsewhere. As he packed the final boxes, David found himself not mourning but marveling at how many stories these books had contained, how many minds they had opened, how many hearts they had touched during their time here. On his final morning walk across the bridge, David carried with him a stone from the riverbank, not as a memento of what he was losing, but as a reminder of what he had learned. The river had taught him that acceptance wasn't about becoming passive in the face of change, but about finding the wisdom to distinguish between what could be controlled and what could not. It had shown him that true strength came not from resistance but from the ability to maintain one's essential nature while adapting to new circumstances. As David drove away from Millbrook for the last time, he carried with him more than just boxes of books and furniture. He carried the river's wisdom, the knowledge that he was not separate from the flow of life but part of it, and the trust that wherever the current took him next, he would find new ways to serve, new communities to build, new readers to guide toward the books that would change their lives. The river, he knew, would continue its ancient journey, teaching patience and acceptance to anyone wise enough to listen. And David would carry its lessons forward, finding new bridges to stand on, new waters to learn from, new ways to flow with the endless current of change that carries us all toward whatever shore awaits. The night shift. At 2:47 a.m., The hospital corridor was quiet, except for the soft whisper of ventilation systems and the distant hum of machines that never slept. Dr. Sarah Chen walked these halls with the practiced quiet of someone who had spent 15 years working night shifts, her footsteps muffled by years of learning to move, without disturbing the delicate peace that settled over the wards during these small hours. Sarah paused outside room 314, where Mrs. Rodriguez lay connected to monitors that painted her vital signs in gentle, rhythmic waves across glowing screens. Tomorrow, today, really, the family would need to make a decision about continuing life support. There was no medical miracle waiting, no treatment left to try. Sarah had delivered this news to hundreds of families over the years, but it never became routine. Each conversation was a sacred threshold, a moment when her role shifted from healer to guide, helping people navigate the territory between hope and acceptance. Through the window, Sarah could see the outline of mountains against the star-filled sky. She had chosen to work nights partly for these moments of stillness, when the hospital's daytime urgency gave way to something more contemplative. Night shift had taught her things about medicine, and about life, that no medical school textbook could convey. Sarah thought about her younger self, fresh out of residency, armored with confidence and an unshakable belief that every medical problem had a solution. She had seen death as failure, suffering as something to be eliminated, uncertainty as the enemy of good medicine. It had taken years of night shifts, countless conversations with patients and families in the quiet hours, to understand that healing sometimes looked very different from curing. The lesson had begun with a patient much like Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly man whose family couldn't accept that his time was ending. Sarah had watched them torture themselves with guilt over hypothetical different choices, agonize over treatment decisions that would only prolong suffering, rage against the unfairness of a world where good people faced terminal diagnoses. She had tried to comfort them with medical facts and statistics, but facts weren't what they needed. It was Marcus Aurelius who had first shown her a different approach, though she encountered his wisdom not in a philosophy classroom but in the most unlikely place. The hospital's break room, in a worn paperback left behind by a retiring nurse. Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate associates you, she had read during a particularly difficult shift. The words had stopped her cold, not because they were revolutionary, but because they named something she was already beginning to understand. Night after night, Sarah had watched families grapple with circumstances beyond their control. She had seen people discover strength they didn't know they possessed, find peace in the midst of chaos, choose love over fear even when facing unimaginable loss. These weren't medical interventions she could prescribe or techniques she could teach. They were human capacities that emerged when people learned to stop fighting reality and started working with it instead. Sarah's phone buzzed softly. A text from the ICU, room 328, asking for you. She recognized the room number. Mr. Park, a middle-aged teacher who had been brought in 3 weeks ago after a massive stroke. His daughter Jennifer had been maintaining a bedside vigil, convinced that her constant presence and fierce determination could somehow will her father back to consciousness. Sarah made her way to the ICU, her mind already preparing for the conversation that awaited. Jennifer was exactly where Sarah expected to find her, in the chair beside her father's bed, holding his hand and talking softly to him about his students, his garden, the book he had been writing about Korean history. She looked up when Sarah entered, her eyes red with exhaustion and desperate hope. "He squeezed my hand," Jennifer said immediately. "About an hour ago, I felt him squeeze my hand. That means he's still fighting, right? That means there's still hope." Sarah sat down in the chair beside Jennifer, close enough to offer presence without invading her space. She had learned that these conversations required proximity, not the clinical distance she had once maintained, but the kind of closeness that said, "I'm here with you in this difficult place." "Tell me what happened," Sarah said gently, and she listened as Jennifer described the barely perceptible pressure she had felt. Sarah had seen this phenomenon countless times, the way desperate hope could transform unconscious reflexes into meaningful communication, how love could create miracles from the smallest biological responses. "Jennifer," Sarah said after a long pause, "your father is very lucky to have someone who loves him as much as you do. The way you've been here for him, talking to him, holding his hand, that's been a gift." Jennifer's face tightened. She had heard this tone before, recognized it as the prelude to conversations she wasn't ready to have. "But the hand squeeze," she said. "Doesn't that mean something?" Sarah chose her words carefully. In her early years, she might have launched into a clinical explanation of unconscious muscle contractions, effectively crushing Jennifer's hope with medical facts. But time and experience had taught her that hope didn't need to be crushed, it needed to be transformed, guided gently toward a different kind of healing. "It means your father's body still has reflexes," Sarah said. "And it means that on some level, he might be aware that you're here. But Jennifer, I need to ask you something important. What would your father want for you right now? If he could see you keeping this vigil, if he could see how exhausted you are, what do you think he would say?" The question seemed to catch Jennifer off guard. She looked at her father's peaceful face, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah saw her see him as he actually was rather than as she needed him to be. "He would tell me to go home," Jennifer whispered. "He would tell me to eat something, to sleep, to take care of myself. He was always taking care of everyone else." She paused, tears flowing freely now. "But I don't know how to let go. I don't know how to stop hoping." Sarah reached out and gently touched Jennifer's shoulder. "What if letting go doesn't mean stopping love? What if it means loving him enough to want what's best for him, even if that's not what's best for you?" They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the quiet beeping of monitors and the whisper of the ventilator. Sarah had learned the power of silence, how it could create space for understanding to emerge naturally rather than being forced through argument or persuasion. "In my culture," Jennifer finally said, "we believe that the dying need permission to go. That sometimes they hold on because they don't want to leave us behind." She looked at Sarah with eyes that held both pain and growing acceptance. "Do you think that's true?" "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that love takes many forms. Sometimes love means holding on, and sometimes it means letting go. Your father has been lucky to feel your love these past weeks. Maybe now he needs to feel your trust that he knows what's best for himself, your trust that love doesn't end when life does." Sarah stayed with Jennifer for another hour, not offering medical advice or false comfort, but simply being present as she worked through her own journey of acceptance. This was the part of medicine they didn't teach in school, the sacred privilege of witnessing people discover their own capacity for wisdom, courage, and grace in the face of impossible circumstances. Eventually, Jennifer asked Sarah to help her understand what the dying process would look like, how she would know when it was time, what she could do to make her father comfortable. These were conversations Sarah had had hundreds of times, but each one felt unique, shaped by the particular love and loss of the people involved. As dawn approached, Sarah made her rounds through the quiet wards. She checked on Mrs. Rodriguez, whose family would arrive in a few hours to say goodbye. She stopped by the room of a young man recovering from a motorcycle accident, whose girlfriend sat reading to him from a book of poetry. She visited an elderly woman with Alzheimer's whose son came every day to show her pictures and tell her stories, even though she no longer recognized him. In each room, Sarah witnessed different forms of the same fundamental human challenge: learning to love and hope and care deeply while accepting that we cannot control the outcomes of our caring. It was a lesson that extended far beyond the hospital walls. She had come to understand. Everyone, patient or not, would eventually need to learn this balance between engagement and acceptance, between doing everything possible and knowing when enough was enough. Sarah thought about her own life, how working night shifts had taught her to find beauty in unexpected places, in the quiet courage of families keeping vigil, in the dignity of people facing their final chapters, in the small moments of connection that made suffering bearable. She had learned to value different things than she once had: presence over productivity, depth over achievement, wisdom over knowledge. The eastern horizon was beginning to lighten when Sarah finally made her way to the hospital chapel. It was a non-denominational space, designed to accommodate any faith or no faith at all, filled with comfortable chairs and soft light. Sarah wasn't particularly religious, but she came here often at the end of difficult shifts, drawn by the silence and the sense of sanctuary it provided. She settled into one of the chairs and let herself feel the weight of the night's encounters. The grief of families learning to say goodbye, the courage of people facing uncertainty, the quiet strength of those who had learned to hope for different things than they once had. These experiences had shaped her into a different kind of doctor than she had once imagined becoming. One who understood that healing wasn't always about fixing what was broken, but sometimes about learning to live gracefully with brokenness. Sarah thought about the Stoic philosophers she had been reading, how their insights had helped her navigate the emotional challenges of working so closely with suffering and death. They had taught her that she could care deeply about her patients without being destroyed by outcomes she couldn't control. They had shown her that acceptance wasn't about becoming indifferent, but about finding peace with the limits of human power while still exercising that power wisely and compassionately. As her shift ended and the day staff began to arrive, Sarah felt the familiar satisfaction of work well done. Not because she had saved lives or performed medical miracles, but because she had helped people navigate some of the most difficult territory human beings ever cross. She had been present for conversations that mattered, offered comfort that helped, witnessed transformations that no medical intervention could create. Walking to her car as the morning sun painted the hospital parking lot in golden light, Sarah carried with her the night's lessons in acceptance. Tomorrow she would return to these same halls, encounter new families facing impossible choices, guide more people through the territory between hope and surrender. And she would bring to that work not just medical knowledge, but the deeper wisdom that comes from understanding how to love without attachment, how to hope without demand, how to care without controlling. The night shift had taught her that some of life's most important healing happened not in operating rooms or with powerful medications, but in quiet conversations at 3 a.m., when people found the courage to face reality with open hearts and discover that acceptance, far from being defeat, could be the most powerful medicine of all. The mountain path. The trail marker read, "Summit, 3.2 miles," but Marcus knew better than to trust such simple calculations. He had been hiking these mountains for 20 years, and altitude had a way of making every step deliberate, every breath precious. At 62, with knees that reminded him daily of their accumulated miles, he understood that reaching the peak was no longer the automatic assumption it had been in his younger days. Marcus adjusted his pack and continued up the winding path that would take him to Eagle's Rest, a modest summit by Colorado standards, but one that held special significance for him. 25 years ago, he had first climbed this mountain with his son Jake, then 8 years old and full of endless energy. They had made it a tradition after that, an annual pilgrimage that continued through Jake's teenage years, his college summers, even the early years of his marriage. But Jake wouldn't be joining him this year. or any year to come. 3 months ago, a drunk driver had ended his son's life in an instant, leaving Marcus to navigate not only his own grief but the complex process of helping his daughter-in-law and 2 young grandchildren rebuild their shattered world. The trail grew steeper, and Marcus found himself stopping more frequently to rest. Each pause gave him time to notice things he might have missed in his younger, more ambitious climbs: the way morning light filtered through aspen leaves, the intricate patterns frost had painted on exposed rocks, the quiet industry of mountain life continuing its ancient routines regardless of human sorrow. This awareness of detail was one of the unexpected gifts grief had brought him. Before Jake's death, Marcus had moved through life with the efficiency of someone who believed time was unlimited and goals were always achievable through sufficient effort. He had been a successful engineer, approaching challenges with the confidence that every problem had a solution waiting to be discovered through analysis and persistence. The mountain was teaching him different lessons now. Here, in the thin air and steep terrain, he was learning the difference between determination and acceptance, between giving up and letting go. Each step forward required him to work with his limitations rather than against them, to listen to his body's wisdom rather than override it with willpower. Marcus paused at a granite outcropping that offered a view back down the valley. Below him, the trail switchbacked through forest and meadow, a brown ribbon connecting the trailhead where he had started to this point of transition between the lower slopes and the final approach to the summit. The path reminded him of something the ancient Stoics had understood: that the journey mattered as much as the destination, that how we traveled was often more important than where we arrived. A chipmunk emerged from behind a boulder, studied Marcus with bright, curious eyes, then continued about its business of gathering seeds for winter storage. Marcus smiled at the creature's focused efficiency, its complete absorption in the work at hand. There was wisdom in such presence, such acceptance of life's seasonal demands. The chipmunk didn't waste energy mourning the end of summer or worrying about spring's distant return. It simply did what needed to be done now. Marcus thought about the weeks following Jake's funeral, how his first instinct had been to retreat from life, to hunker down in his grief like an animal in a cave. Friends and family had encouraged him to stay busy, to distract himself with projects and travel. But the mountain had called to him differently, offering not distraction but encounter, a place where he could meet his grief directly, without the well-meaning interruptions of social consolation. The trail continued upward, winding through a stand of ancient pines whose roots had found purchase in rocky soil, whose branches had weathered decades of mountain storms. Marcus leaned against one of these giants, feeling the rough texture of bark that had protected the tree through countless seasons of growth and dormancy, abundance and scarcity. These trees understood something about endurance that went beyond mere survival. They had learned to bend without breaking, to let go of branches that could no longer be sustained, to grow slowly and steadily rather than reaching too quickly for the sky. They were masters of the long view, measuring time in decades rather than days, success in persistence rather than speed. Marcus pulled out his water bottle and drank slowly, letting himself feel the luxury of rest without guilt. In his working years, he had measured hikes by pace and efficiency, always pushing toward the next milestone. Now, he was learning to measure them differently, by presence, by awareness, by the depth of his engagement with each moment of the journey. This shift in perspective had been one of grief's unexpected teachings. In the immediate aftermath of Jake's death, Marcus had felt the familiar engineer's urge to fix what was broken, to find solutions that would restore what had been lost. He had thrown himself into practical tasks, helping with funeral arrangements, managing insurance claims, researching grief counseling options for his daughter-in-law. Action felt better than acceptance. Doing felt safer than being. But the mountain trails had gradually taught him that some losses couldn't be fixed, only integrated. Some problems didn't have solutions, only responses. Some journeys led not to conquest but to understanding, not to achievement but to wisdom. The path ahead grew more challenging, transitioning from forest trail to rocky scramble. Marcus approached each section with the careful assessment he had learned to apply to all difficult terrain. What were the real risks? What were his actual capabilities? How could he proceed safely while still making progress toward his goal? These questions had become his daily practice in the months since Jake's death. How could he help his grandchildren process their loss without overwhelming them with his own grief? How could he support his daughter-in-law's healing without trying to replace what she had lost? How could he honor his son's memory without getting trapped in the past? The Stoic philosophers he had been reading talked about the discipline of desire, learning to want what we have rather than having what we want. On this mountain, Marcus was discovering what that meant in practice. He was learning to want the hike he was actually taking rather than the hike he had planned, to appreciate the body he currently inhabited rather than mourning the one he had lost to age, to find meaning in the journey he was living rather than the one that had been interrupted by loss. A marmot whistled from a nearby boulder, its sharp call echoing off the rock faces above. Marcus paused to watch the creature's alert posture, its careful scanning of the environment for both opportunity and danger. The marmot lived completely in the present moment, neither reliving past summers nor anticipating future winters. It simply existed fully in the now, responding appropriately to whatever each moment required. This presence was what Marcus was seeking on the mountain, not escape from grief, but the ability to experience it fully without being consumed by it. He was learning the difference between pain and suffering, between the natural sadness of loss and the additional anguish created by fighting against reality. The trail curved around a massive rock formation, revealing a small alpine lake nestled in a cirque below the final summit approach. Marcus had forgotten about this hidden gem, tucked away from the main path but visible to those who took the time to look. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the surrounding peaks like a natural mirror. Marcus left the trail and made his way carefully down to the lake's edge. The silence here was profound, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind across the water's surface. He found a comfortable boulder and settled in to rest, knowing that this unexpected discovery was as valuable as reaching the official summit. Sitting beside the still water, Marcus thought about the lake's seasonal cycle. In winter, it would be locked under ice and snow, appearing lifeless to casual observers. But beneath that frozen surface, life would continue at its own patient pace, waiting for spring's return. The lake understood something about dormancy that Marcus was only beginning to learn, that apparent inactivity could be a form of preparation, that sometimes the deepest growth happened in periods that looked like nothing was happening at all. His grief, Marcus realized, might follow a similar pattern. There would be seasons of active sorrow, times when tears came easily and memories felt overwhelming. But there would also be periods of apparent stillness, when the loss seemed integrated into the background of daily life. Neither state was better or worse, they were simply different phases of the same long process of healing. A fish rose to the surface of the lake, creating expanding circles that eventually reached the shore where Marcus sat. He watched the ripples spread outward until they disappeared, struck by how perfectly this demonstrated something he had been trying to understand about loss and healing. Jake's death was like that fish breaking the surface, a single event that had created waves affecting every aspect of Marcus's life. Some ripples had been immediate and dramatic, others were subtle and ongoing. But eventually, like the lake's surface, life would find its new equilibrium. Marcus pulled out the small journal he had been keeping since Jake's death, not for profound insights but for simple observations about each day's journey through grief. Today he wrote about the marmot's presence, the lake's teaching about seasons, the way his body was learning to climb at a different pace. These small noticings had become his practice of acceptance, acknowledging what was actually happening, rather than focusing on what should be happening, or what he wished were happening. After an hour beside the lake, Marcus felt ready to continue toward the summit. The final approach was the steepest part of the trail, requiring him to stop frequently and breathe deeply in the thin air. Each rest gave him another opportunity to practice what the mountain was teaching him about pacing, about listening to his body's signals, about finding sustainable rhythms for challenging terrain. As he climbed, Marcus thought about a conversation he had had with his therapist about the difference between healing and curing. "We can't cure grief," she had told him. "We can only learn to carry it more skillfully." At the time, this had felt like a consolation prize, a disappointing substitute for the complete recovery he had hoped for. But on the mountain, he was beginning to understand what she meant. The summit approached gradually, marked not by a dramatic final ascent, but by the slow realization that there was nowhere higher to go. Marcus reached Eagle's Rest as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley below, painting the landscape in shades of gold and purple that made the whole world seem to glow. He had expected this moment to be difficult, arriving at the place he had shared so many times with Jake but would never share again. Instead, he felt something unexpected: gratitude. Gratitude for the 25 years of hikes they had enjoyed together. Gratitude for the mountains that had taught them both to love the natural world. Gratitude for the memories that no tragedy could take away. Marcus found the flat boulder where he and Jake had always stopped to eat lunch and share the view. He unpacked his simple meal, a sandwich, some trail mix, the thermos of coffee that had become his hiking ritual. As he ate, he felt Jake's presence not as absence but as integration, woven into the fabric of this place and this experience in ways that transcended physical presence. The view from Eagle's Rest stretched for miles in every direction, encompassing peaks and valleys, forests and meadows, the intricate geography of a landscape shaped by millions of years of patient geological forces. From this perspective, Marcus could see the trail he had climbed as just one small thread in a vast tapestry of interconnected paths and possibilities. This aerial view offered another lesson in acceptance. From the summit, the struggles of the ascent, the steep sections that had required frequent rest, the rocky scrambles that had demanded careful attention, looked small and manageable, not because they hadn't been challenging, but because they were now part of a completed journey, integrated into a larger story of persistence and adaptation. Marcus realized that this was what he was learning about grief as well. The acute pain of the first months, the anger at life's unfairness, the disorientation of having his future rewritten without his consent, all of these remained real and valid experiences. But from the growing perspective of time and acceptance, they were becoming part of a larger story about love, resilience, and the human capacity to find meaning even in loss. As the afternoon light began to fade, Marcus prepared for the descent. Going down would present its own challenges: the need for different muscles, careful attention to footing, the discipline of moving slowly when gravity urged speed. But he had learned not to rush these transitions, to give each phase of the journey the attention it deserved. Before leaving the summit, Marcus performed a small ritual he had not planned but that felt necessary. He found a small stone, smooth and gray, warmed by hours of mountain sun. This would be his carrying stone, he decided, not a memento to preserve the past unchanged, but a reminder to carry forward what was most essential from this experience. The descent took longer than expected, requiring the kind of patience Marcus was still learning to cultivate. His knees reminded him with each step that he was no longer 25, that some forms of youthful confidence were no longer available to him. But other capacities had emerged to take their place. Wisdom about pacing, attention to present moment awareness, the hard-won ability to find satisfaction in efforts that fell short of perfect execution. As twilight settled over the mountains and Marcus reached his car in the trailhead parking lot, he felt the deep tiredness that comes from work well done. He had not conquered the mountain. Mountains, he had learned, were not meant to be conquered. Instead, he had collaborated with it, learned from it, allowed it to teach him something about his own capacity for adaptation and growth. Driving home through the mountain darkness, Marcus reflected on what he would tell his grandchildren about this hike when he saw them tomorrow. Not stories of triumph or achievement, but tales of discovery and acceptance. He would tell them about the marmot's presence, the lake's seasonal wisdom, the way mountains taught patience to anyone willing to learn. He would share what he was slowly understanding about carrying love forward, even when the people we love are no longer physically present. Most importantly, he would help them understand that healing didn't mean forgetting, that acceptance didn't mean giving up, that finding peace with loss was not a betrayal of love, but its deepest expression. The mountain had taught him that some journeys had no finish line, only the ongoing practice of taking the next step with attention and care. As Marcus pulled into his driveway, he felt the carrying stone in his pocket, warmed now by his own body heat rather than the mountain sun. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own opportunities to practice what he had learned about acceptance and adaptation. But tonight, he rested in the satisfaction of having climbed faithfully, descended safely, and discovered once again that the mountain's greatest gift was not the view from the summit, but the transformation that occurred along the way.